Welcome to Crimson Secrets. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button. We post new stories every week, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming. And before we get into today's story, drop a comment below and tell us what city you're watching from. We love knowing where our Crimson family is tuning in from. All right, let's get into it. The day Harlow Whitmore signed the IPO paperwork, she was sitting alone in a glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor of a building her ex-husbander she'd never be able to afford. She used a pen she'd bought at a gas station for $1.49. That detail mattered to her. She'd thought about it for weeks afterward, not the $4.7 billion valuation printed on the cover page, not the row of attorneys who'd flown in from 3 different time zones, not the journalists already gathering in the lobby downstairs. Just the pen. Cheap blue ink. The kind that bleeds a little if you press too hard. She pressed hard anyway, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. This story starts the way so many of these stories do, not with a triumph, but with a door being slammed. Harlow Beaumont was 26 years old when she married Donovan Whitmore. He was 32, already a partner, at a mid-sized consulting firm in Chicago. The kind of man who wore confidence like a second skin and made everything around him feel slightly more organized just by walking into a room. He was handsome in a way that photographs couldn't quite capture. Something in the eyes, people always said. Something that made you feel like the most important person in the room when he looked at you. For the first 2 years, that look was aimed entirely at Harlow. She'd been finishing her MBA at Northwestern when they met, a mutual friend's dinner party. She'd spent most of the evening in the corner, talking to the host's golden retriever, which should have told Donovan something about her, though he would later claim it was what made him fall in love with her. The way she'd sat cross-legged on the floor, completely unself-conscious, scratching behind the dog's ears while everyone else networked. "You were the only real person in that room," he told her on their second date. She believed him. That was the first mistake. Not the believing. Harlow was not a naive woman. She'd grown up watching her mother work double shifts at a diner in Rockford, Illinois, and she understood too early that most things people said with that much sincerity were things they meant in the moment and forgot by morning. But she believed Donovan because she wanted to, and wanting to believe something she would later understand is its own kind of blindness. They married in October, small ceremony. Her mother cried. His parents flew in from Connecticut and smiled the way people smile when they're being polite about something they disapprove of. Harlow noticed. She filed it away. The first year was good. She finished her MBA. He made junior partner. They bought a condo in Lincoln Park. His money, mostly, though she covered utility groceries without being asked, because that was the kind of person she was. She didn't keep score. She'd been raised to believe that relationships were about contributing, not accounting. She should have kept score, because Donovan did. It started small, the way these things always do. A comment about her career trajectory. She'd taken a research position at a small biotech startup called Lumen Sciences, which paid less than a third of what her MBA peers were making at consulting firms and investment banks. "You're too smart for this," he'd say, and at first it sounded like encouragement. It took her longer than she liked to admit to realize it wasn't. What he meant was, this is embarrassing to explain at dinner parties. Lumen Sciences was working on something nobody believed in yet, a platform for early detection diagnostics using AI-driven protein analysis. The science was sound. The funding was not. Harlow had joined as employee number 7, which meant she wore 17 hats and worked hours that would have been illegal in most European countries. She'd come home at 10, 11, midnight sometimes. Donovan would be asleep, or pretending to be. In the morning, he'd make a point of noting the time she'd gotten in. "Another late one," he'd say, not looking up from his phone. "We're in the middle of a trial run. It won't always be like this. You've been saying that for 8 months. She had. She wasn't wrong to keep saying it. But she began to see, slowly, the gap between what Donovan said and what Donovan wanted. He said he admired her work ethic. What he wanted was a wife who was home by 7 and interested in his day. He said he respected her ambition. What he wanted was for her ambition to operate at a volume that didn't inconvenience him. He said he loved her for exactly who she was. What he loved was who she'd been at that dinner party. Soft-spoken, a little distracted, paying more attention to a dog than to the crowd. That woman, as it turned out, had a company to build. It took 4 years. 4 years of Donovan's silences that stretched longer each month. 4 years of him canceling plans she'd made and making plans without consulting her. 4 years of small cruelties dressed up as concern. You look tired. Are you sure you should keep doing this? Maybe a job with better hours would make you happier. 4 years of learning, one conversation at a time, that when he said us, he meant himself, plus a version of her that didn't exist anymore. She stayed because she was in the middle of something she couldn't walk away from, and because she still believed, somewhere in the part of herself that hadn't yet caught up with the evidence, that he would come around, that he would see it. That one morning, he'd wake up and understand what she was trying to do. He never did. The night it ended, she came home at 11:30. They were 2 weeks out from submitting their Series B pitch deck. She'd been in the office since 6 in the mornings. She smelled like stale coffee and the kind of exhaustion that lives behind your eyes. She set her bag down by the door. Donovan was sitting at the kitchen table with the lights low, and something about the way he was sitting, very still, very deliberate, told her before he said a single word. "I think we should end this," he said. She didn't say anything for a moment. She stood in the doorway with her coat still on. "Harlow." He said her name like a period at the end of a sentence. "I heard you," she said. "I've tried, you know I've tried." He had his hands flat on the table, and he was looking at them rather than her, which told her everything but the kind of courage this was. "But I can't keep doing this. I've been alone in this marriage for 2 years. Maybe longer." There were things she could have said. There were things that were true, that she had told him more than once, what this period would cost them both, that she had asked him specifically to be patient, that she had come home every night, even the bad ones, even when it would have been easier to sleep on the office couch, that she had chosen him, kept choosing him, even as it became increasingly clear that the choice was not being returned. She said none of it. She unbuttoned her coat, folded it over the back of a chair, sat down across from him and said, "Okay." That one word did something to his face that she would remember. For a long time, he'd expected a fight. He'd steeled himself. For one, she could see it in his jaw, in the set of his shoulders. He'd been rehearsing a different conversation, one where he got to be reasonable in the face of her emotion. She'd taken that away from him without trying. "Okay," he repeated. "What would you like to do about the condo?" They were divorced 4 months later. Lumen Sciences closed its Series B 7 weeks after the papers were finalized. 18 months after that, they were in clinical partnerships with 3 hospital systems and a deal pending with a diagnostic company out of Boston that would have made the front page of the Wall Street Journal. If anyone had been paying attention to a small biotech in Chicago, run by a 34-year-old woman with no famous backers and no family money, nobody was paying attention. That was, Harlow would later say, the greatest advantage she ever had. Donovan had moved on quickly. A woman named... It didn't matter what her name was. She was pleasant-looking in the way that his parents would approve of, and she worked in marketing, and she was home by 6. Harlow knew these things because Chicago is smaller than it pretends to be, and because mutual friends with the very best intentions kept telling her. She didn't ask. She listened, said very little, and went back to work. She did not spend her energy on Donovan Whitmore. She spent it on a protein biomarker called L7 that her lead researcher, a quietly brilliant woman named Dr. Camille Forsyth, had been tracking for 2 years. L7 appeared, and this was the part that kept Harlow awake at night, in the best possible way, to flag the presence of 3 different early-stage cancers a full 18 months before any conventional screening method could detect them. 18 months. She would sit in the dark of her apartment and think about what 18 months meant in the life of a person with cancer they didn't know they had yet. She thought about it not as a business opportunity, though it was, but as a fact. A number. A gap between knowing and not knowing that could be the difference between someone making it to their kid's graduation or not. That was the thing about Harlow Beaumont that Donovan had never understood. She wasn't in it for the money. The money was coming anyway. By the time Lumen Sciences was 3 years post-divorce, they had 47 employees, a research facility in the Fulton Market District, and a partnership with the University Marquis Hospital that had put L7 into a Phase 2 clinical trial. The results were, the word her lead attorney used was staggering. Harlow's word was obvious. She'd known what the results would be. She'd built the company around that knowledge. She was 37 years old. That year, a private equity firm called Meridian Capital reached out through an intermediary. She knew Meridian. Everyone in biotech knew Meridian. They were the kind of fund that showed up when they smelled something transformative. Which meant their interest alone was a signal. The intermediary was careful, professional, and completely transparent about the fact that Meridian was not their only client currently evaluating Lumen Sciences, which meant there were others. Harlow took exactly 72 hours to respond, not because she needed time to think. She'd been preparing for exactly this conversation for 3 years. But because she understood the psychology of the room she was about to enter. And in that room, how long you took to call back was itself a form of communication. She let them wait. Then she hired the best M&A attorney in Chicago, a woman who charged a number that made Harlow's old MBA classmates faint when they heard it, and she began the most important negotiation of her life. She did not tell anyone outside of her core team. Not her mother, who she still called every Sunday. Not her 2 closest friends from Northwestern. Not the industry contacts who'd taken meetings with her when Lumen was still operating out of a converted supply closet. No one. This was not paranoia. This was strategy. She had spent 4 years learning what happened when you let people into a process before it was finished. You got their fear, their doubt, their projections, all of it dressed up as concern. She didn't have space for other people's fears. Right now. She barely had space for her own. There were nights she lay on the floor of her apartment. Not the couch, not the bed, the floor, specifically, because something about the firmness of it was grounding, and ran every scenario. What if Meridian walked? What if the Phase 2 data had an error she hadn't caught? What if the Boston deal collapsed and took their valuation with it? What if she'd built something extraordinary and still managed to time it wrong? She ran the scenarios until she knew every exit in the building. Then she got up off the floor, made coffee. The negotiations took 11 weeks. There were 4 rounds of offers. The first offer was insultingly structured, heavy on earnouts, light on upfront, and she walked out of the room without raising her voice. The second offer was better. She asked for a week to review it, spent that week engineering 2 competing expressions of interest from other parties, then came back to the table with the second offer and politely dismantled it, line by line. By the 4th offer, the room had changed. She could feel it. 11 people on the other side of the table, ranging from a 28-year-old analyst who kept looking at his phone to James Kellerman, 61 years old, the co-founder of Meridian Capital, who had not personally attended a negotiation in 7 years and who was watching her the way a person watches something they're trying to classify. She knew he was recalibrating. She let him. Dr. Forsyth's L7 trial data, she said, placing a folder on the table. Phase 2, 18-month follow-up. We haven't released this publicly yet. She let the silence do what it needed to do. $4.7 billion. 83% of it going directly to Harlow Beaumont, Whitmore, founder, majority, shareholder, and the woman who had once come home at 11:30 to find her husband, sitting at the kitchen table with his hands flat and his eyes down. She signed the paperwork on a Thursday. With a gas station pen. She didn't plan for him to find out the way he did. In fact, she hadn't thought much about Donovan at all. In the final weeks of the deal, he'd become background noise. Somewhere in year 2, the kind of thing you stop noticing because you've reorganized your life around its absence. She didn't hate him. She wasn't sure she felt much of anything when she thought about him. He was a chapter, and the chapter was closed. And she was several books down the road from it. It was her college roommate Phoebe who told her. Not intentionally. Phoebe wasn't that kind of person. But Phoebe ran in the same social circles as Don's fiancé. They were engaged by now, apparently. And when the Tribune ran a piece on the Lumen Sciences deal with a photo of Harlow and the headline that her attorney had negotiated with editorial ruthlessness. Phoebe had texted, "I just saw the news, I'm literally shaking for you." Also, for what it's worth, I heard from somebody that Donovan saw it too. Harlow read the text, set her phone down, and went to make tea. She thought about it while the kettle boiled. She tried to locate something in herself. Satisfaction, vindication, some clean, bright feeling of there it is. And found instead something quieter and more difficult to name. Not emptiness, exactly. More like resolution. The sense that a long equation had finally balanced, not with drama, but with the patient inevitability of math. She poured the tea, she drank it by the window. That was it. Except it wasn't quite, because 3 days later Donovan called. Wait. She saw his name on her phone and held it there for a moment. Just a moment, not long, and then she set it face down on her desk and finished the email she was writing. He called again, the next morning. Then once more the day after that. She didn't answer. It wasn't cruelty. It wasn't strategy either. Not anymore. She genuinely had nothing to say to him. Not because she was angry. The anger had been a small, quiet thing that had burned out years ago, leaving behind something cleaner. But because whatever conversation he wanted to have, she had already had it. With herself, alone, in the years of work that followed. She'd had that conversation 1,000 times in parking garages and airplane cabins and 3 a.m. offices, and she'd worked through every version of it, and she'd arrived on the other side, knowing exactly what she wanted to say to him. Nothing. Not as a punishment. Just as a fact, she had nothing left to say. She found out later, Phoebe again, who couldn't help it. That he'd told someone at a dinner party that he'd known all along Harlow would do something like this, that he'd always believed in her, that the divorce had been mutual. She laughed when she heard that. It was a real laugh, not a bitter one. The kind that comes from deep in the chest when something is genuinely, unexpectedly funny. Because she thought about the man sitting at that table, hands flat, eyes down, and she thought about the story he had spent years built to himself, and she thought about how much energy it must take to maintain the version of events where you are never the one who got it wrong. She felt something close to pity. Then she let it go. The Meridian deal closed on a Friday in April. There was a celebration. Her team had rented out a restaurant in River North, and people gave speeches, and Dr. Forsyth, who was normally so composed she made mathematicians look emotional, stood up with a glass of champagne and said, "When Harlow hired me, I asked her what she was trying to build. She said, something that gives people more time. I think that's what we did." There were tears. Not from Harlow, she cried later, in the car, alone. On the way home, the kind of crying that has nothing to do with sadness and everything to do with the release of something that has been held for a very long time. She thought about her mother's diner in Rockford, the particular smell of it, coffee and fryer oil, and the synthetic vanilla of the cleaning spray her mother used on the tables. The way her mother's feet would swell by the end of a double shift. The way she'd still make Harlow a hot chocolate when she got home, no matter how tired she was. She thought about the condo in Lincoln Park, the nights she'd come home to silence and made it mean nothing. She thought about the floor of her apartment and the coffee she made at 2 in the morning and the way L7 had looked on paper the first time Dr. Forsyth showed her. Just a graph, just a line, but the line said something that no one else had figured out yet. And Harlow had known in her body, before she'd worked it through, in her mind. She thought about none of it as tragedy. That was the thing people kept getting wrong when they heard her story, and people were hearing it now in a way they hadn't been before. Journalists, podcasters, other founders reaching out. Everyone wanted the narrative of survival. The comeback arc. The woman who was broken and then rebuilt. She had not been broken. She had been building the whole time, while everyone else assumed she was simply getting through. There's a difference, she would say, when she bothered to say anything, between surviving something and using it. I wasn't surviving, Donovan. I was just working. He happened to be in the background. Her mother flew in from Rockford the following week. They had dinner at a place on the lake. Just the two of them, no occasion. Just food and water, and the specific ease of two people who have known each other long enough to not need to perform. Her mother, whose name was Carol, and who had worked in a diner for 23 years, and had strong opinions about pie, and the designated hitter rule, looked at Harlow across the table and said, "You look different. Different how?" "Lighter." She thought about it. "Like you put something down." Harlow looked out at the water. "Yeah," she said. "I think I did." Her mother nodded and ate her fish and didn't push it further because Carol Beaumont understood her daughter well enough to know that some things are complete in the saying of them. They split a piece of chocolate cake for dessert. Her mother ate most of it. On the way home, Harlow drove with the windows down even though it was April in Chicago and technically too cold for it. The city looked different from the driver's seat, the same streets, the same skyline, the same lake, but arranged differently somehow. Like a room she'd been living in that she'd finally decided to redecorate. Not because anything had changed. Because she had. She drove home. She parked. She went upstairs and sat by the window for a long time in particular. Not being in the room, in the city, in the life she had built in the specific way that she had built it. Stubbornly, methodically, without asking anyone's permission. Then she went to sleep. She had a 7 a.m. call with the board of directors of a hospital system in Boston that wanted to talk about what came next. She had a lot of things to talk about. She was just getting started.